Good morning to the DME for Peace community, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. These Thursday Talk webinars are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell, and I'm the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, based in the wonderfully humid Washington, DC. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Tilman Brück and Neil Ferguson of the International Security and Development Center as we discuss Do Jobs Aid Peace and the impact of employment programming on peace. A note about our format for those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks. Once Neil and Tilman have finished their presentation, we'll jump right into a question and answer session. You can ask your questions in advance of the discussion portion by submitting them through the question function on GoToWebinar throughout the presentation. I'm now going to hand over to today's host to get underway. Neil and Tilman, you are very welcome to the Thursday Talks. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jack, for hosting us. It's a pleasure to present today. My name is Tilman Brück, as you said, from the International Security and Development Center in Berlin, and I will be co-presenting with my colleague Neil Ferguson, who will join us. So I'd like to kick off. We started several different research projects a while ago, looking at the impact of employment programming on stability. When we started this work, we thought there would be a wealth of evidence out there, and we would just need to sort of synthesize it and distill some lessons learned from that. But as Neil and I will show in a moment, in a sense, that approach was topsy-turvy. Next. And you could argue that instead, sorry, Neil, can you go one back, please? Yeah, thanks. Yep. In a sense that what we are doing is we're talking you through a research agenda in reverse. And to explain in a little bit more detail what we mean by that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are our starting points. We have done 3 research projects on this topic. One was on opportunity reducing instability with several colleagues in the Netherlands, and Ethiopia and Rwanda. Then a large project on employment interventions and peace for the ILO, the Peace Building Support Office of the UN, UNDP, and the World Bank. And finally, a current project ongoing with Mercy Corps on testing the link between employment programs and social stability. And throughout these projects, there is this idea that job creation can help build peace. But as we learned to our avail, we had to question that assumption very critically, and that's where Neil will take over and talk you through our presentation. Neil?
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Tilman, and hello everyone. Thank you again to Jack for having us. I want to give a quick outline of the presentation. It's probably a lot to try and fit into 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll try not to speak too quickly. But broadly speaking, the categories we've placed this into are fairly standard presentation, except as Tilman said, we're basically going to present a research agenda in reverse. So instead of learning from case studies, we will first hear about what we tried to learn from research. And I think if I do this successfully, what I will do is trick you into thinking through exactly the same way that we thought when we were beginning this research agenda. And you will learn, as we learn throughout, where these assumptions fell down. So the first thing we want to do is to talk about the context, or basically why might employment programs or employment more generally linked to stability. And I should say that I'm probably going to do a horrible thing in this presentation of using stability sometimes and peace building sometimes. Pretty much we're going to use these to refer to the same concept. It might not be technically correct, but they basically refer to the terminology of the different projects that we've conducted. So what we have come up with is a basic idea that there are 3 headline relationships onto which employment and employment programs map when they're trying to build stability. The first one we call lack of opportunity, and this is your sort of Paul Collier style macro level analysis of looking at the fact that conflict happens in poor countries. So it might be that poverty causes conflict, and if you think through that in terms of the seminal work of Gary Becker, for example, you can see that that also might link to various forms of antisocial behavior and crime and so forth. So people with the lowest opportunity have the lowest opportunity cost of doing something illegal or something antisocial, and therefore if employment programs can boost those up or increase those opportunity costs, I should say, then they should reduce violent or pre-violent behavior. The second is the existence of grievance. And this takes the notion that if Collier is right, we still see lots of conflicts that happen in countries that are developed, or at least relatively developed, but also that we see that there are lots of poor countries that don't have conflict. So maybe it's not just the absence of opportunity, there might be something else, and that's where grievance comes in. And we define this as a feeling of resentment over something that is, or at least is perceived to be, unfair. In this situation, inequalities, vertical ones between individuals in society and government, or horizontal ones between different societal groups, can lead to annoyance and frustration, which in turn can boil into conflict. The role that employment and employment programs plays there, therefore, should also be relatively prescriptive once thought in those terms, that if programs can reduce those feelings of inequality or reduce those actual inequalities, then we should see a reduction in conflict and instability. The lack of conflict in those terms is sort of slightly left field because it refers much more to sort of non-economically rational perceptions or non-economically rational thoughts that pretty much when groups in society are separated, then interactions between the groups can either be adverse or they can lead to the formation of stereotypes and so forth. And so how this idea works is that employment brings people together. It might bring people together across group and ethnic lines and so forth, and therefore that might have a role in reducing the tensions between those groups. This builds on work that has especially been done in post-conflict situations where, for example, sort of talking workshops have taken place where people come together to talk about the differences in their groups. The upside of these is that they tend to work. The downside is that they often prove to be very, very stressful. And so whilst they might improve in-group, out-group understanding, they might not be the most productive way to do so. In work, training programs and so forth, where individuals are not focusing on these in-group, out-group differences, they may still have the chance to build those. And just a very quick thing to say that although we discuss these in silos, it's not necessarily the case. You can probably imagine easily from what I've said that grievance and conflict in particular probably go very strongly together, and opportunity and grievance might also do so. So what we want to do is to try and learn from these theories of change and what's been done in terms of research. So as Tilman said before, there is a really large universe of employment programs. And I apologize that this is a slightly boring slide, but you'll see a little bit more about it in a few moments. What we find is that there are over 2,400 employment programs that have taken place since 2005 up until about 2016 when we did this research, that focus on developing employment in fragile and conflict-affected states. So we're talking about a really big universe of programs from which people could have done interesting case studies and so forth. So Tilman and I thought, aha, this will be really easy. What we're going to do is we will pluck out the best analyses of these 2,415 programs, and we will conduct a meta-analysis. Unfortunately, what we actually found is that there are probably only 4 or 5 analyses that look at the impact of employment programs on peace or stability in the academic literature. And perhaps more importantly, from a meta-analytical point of view, the results are very mixed. They might actually be pessimistic in terms of saying, not that they make things worse, but maybe they don't make things better in the way we would hope. And as we'll see later, actually, they use all kinds of different stability indicators as well. So what we came to the conclusion is, oh, actually, wait a minute, there aren't enough programs to do this meta-analysis. Not to be deterred, we do what we call a pseudo-meta-analysis instead, because we had a donor to, we had a project that we had promised to a donor, and we wanted to be able to pull together interesting results that were within that framework. So what we did instead was we looked at the list of 2,415 employment programs in fragile and conflict-affected states. We looked at ones that feasibly were actually deliberately designed to build peace. So not just that it was an infrastructure program in one of those countries that, as a product of building a road or other infrastructure, led to short-term creation of jobs. We're looking here at programs that really were aimed at building jobs and are building peace through jobs, I should say. What we find is that when we think of the data requirements we have and everything else, there are actually only 5 countries where we could do this. And these are Burundi, Guinea, Liberia, Mali, and Uganda. And what we wanted to do was test the impact of programs within those countries. So what you will tend to find is that in each of these countries, there are districts that received employment for stability programs and districts that didn't. And from these, we generate this sort of pseudo treatment and control groups. And we link that to a range of stability indicators that we pull out of Afrobarometer. So that's why the list is so small, that we needed a list of countries with projects that we could evaluate, but also with projects that we could evaluate that fell between 2 ways of the Afrobarometer data. And what we find is, so I'm going to show you this table first, and then I'll condense it a little bit. But what we find is that in some indicators, we see robust and really positive effects. In others, we see, if anything, quite negative effects. And in others, we see a complete jumble, and it's hard to pull anything out. But what we see, first of all, is that employment effects are mixed. In fact, what we see more than that is that employment for peace programs don't necessarily take place in the most fragile places within these countries. So whether employment is the correct prescription or not is one thing. The second is whether or not the employment effects itself are realized. And often they're not. In some countries they are. In some countries, actually employment seems to get worse as a consequence of the program. What we will take from that is that if the programs are having an effect, it might be that it's the presence of the program itself or the signal it sends rather than the impact the program has. What we see is that fear of crime improves in all 5 locations. So people are less worried about being victims of violence, essentially. Trust in government, which is taking this sort of Nat Coletta idea that trust in government might be linked to wider social stability and so forth, is very mixed. But actually, if we do a pooled version of this analysis, where we put all of the countries together, we see that it is actually negative. There's little interaction between programs and satisfaction with the government's performance. And finally, we see actually a general reduction in more general life satisfaction measures in the treatment regions across almost all of the countries. So what you can kind of see from that is, well, there's maybe some grounds for optimism here. Fear of crime has gone down, but others have, if anything, maybe got a little bit worse. So it's not a clear-cut picture. And so we wanted to think, well, if we can't do a meta-analysis, we still have 2,415 programs. And maybe we can pull out lots of learning from those programs, because almost all agencies mandate that programs have to have a final report and so forth. So of the 2,415 programs, we realized we can't read 2,415 program reports. What we can do is, through a sort of systematic evaluation style approach, we can whittle that down. And so what we first find are 432 programs that are employment programs with a suitable focus, type, and target, and more importantly, with a suitable location, that it is actually a place where conflict and instability is a meaningful concern. Of those, however, we find that actually at the tail end, things get smaller and smaller and smaller. So we have only 69 projects that what we would call well documented. And this means basically that they have a final report and an inception report. So 69 of 2,415 is quite shocking. I assure you it was very shocking to the agencies that we worked with as well. Of those, 51 have been evaluated either internally or externally, and we took 33 to look at in great depth. Perhaps the most amazing thing to take from this is that although we have 51 well-evaluated programs, we have 51 well-evaluated programs that look at the employment impact of an employment for peace program. We have none, zero, zilch, that look at the peace building impact. So actually learning from programs is maybe not all it's cracked up to be. Perhaps more so, we wanted to see if we can at least pull out the theories of change. So if we're saying that, well, maybe it's not necessary to evaluate the impact of an employment for peace program and peace, if we have a really good reason to believe that that program is going to, if that program has a really good theoretical reason to have that, if it performs in the employment sense. So for a list of 33 or so programs, we tried to pull out the theories of change. And what we see is actually that there are only 9 where there are theories of change present at all. So although this diagram might look quite optimistic, what we're really talking about here is that 9 programs of 33 specifically selected because they're well documented, only 9 have notable theories of change, which means that there are 24 where they're missing, which is more than a third, or almost a third, sorry, more than a third of the entire total. So actually what we would take from that is that learning from programs is certainly not what it could be. But trying to be more optimistic, or at least sort of more forward-looking in terms of this, I think it would be easy to say, oh, this is terrible, but what can we do about it? Or, you know, this is terrible, let's forget about it. But what we wanted to ask is, what can we do about it? And so what we kind of learned is that a lot of programs are unclear about what they actually want to achieve. They use big words like stability or peace, but is it really plausible that a program that is going to target 750 people in one province of Mali is going to overcome the conflict? And therefore, as a result, you end up with a situation where it's not clear what a program thinks it is capable of doing. And therefore, that the theories of change often reflect more of something of an unspecified desirable state of nature, that in a given country, there is a desirable state of nature that the program wants to achieve. But precisely what that is confused at best, and perhaps more importantly, it's going to be very different in every country. If you want to run a stability program in a country like Liberia, where there is, or at least are perceptions of young people getting involved in low-level crime and so forth, the policy prescription to stop that is probably actually very different from something, so from a program that one might run in Lebanon or Jordan, where the interactions and the quality of interactions between displaced and host populations are much more important. And so that brings me to learning from case studies, because this is probably where we should have started. But as I said, you know, if you have 2,400 programs, it seems logical to believe that lots and lots of them have good evaluations that you can work with. And as I hinted at the start, there's actually a relatively small number. And I've pulled up 4 here. It could well be that these 4 are, or at least are very close to, actually the entire population of employment for peace programs. We have Chris Blattman's work with Nathan Fiala and Sebastian Martinez from 2014, where they show that there are really impressive economic gains for individuals who receive cash transfers in Uganda, but there's no impact on peace and stability indicators. We have some work from Mercy Corps in 2015, who analyzed their INVEST program in Afghanistan and found that whilst there are really impressive economic gains, there's no impact on peace and stability. We have Chris Blattman's later work, where he looks at cash transfers and cognitive behavioral therapy in Liberia. What he finds is that if you give the employment part of the program, the cash transfers part of the program alone, there's no impact. But when you give it with CBT, there's a really big impact. So what this maybe says is that employment is certainly not a sufficient condition for building stability. Finally, some work by Jay Lyle and his co-authors in Afghanistan in 2018. This is another Mercy Corps program. What they find is that they test a training program, a cash transfers, and a combination of them both. And that there's no effect from the training alone. The cash transfer has a boom-bust impact when it's provided alone. So initially, people's sort of perceptions of stability and acceptance of violence goes down, but then actually goes back up to it being higher than it was before, and that there are positive effects from the combined treatment. Across those different countries, we have Uganda, 2 in Afghanistan, and 1 in Liberia. We see that actually stability is probably a very different concept in each of those. So the Blattman paper from 2014, we have community cohesion, public good contribution, aggressive behavior, protest attitudes, a whole range of instability indicators, most of which are insignificant. The Mercy Corps programs both use an endorsement experiment on the acceptance of political violence in Afghanistan, and more recently we have self-reported engagement in antisocial behaviors and arrest data from the work in Liberia. So, oh, sorry, I've jumped a little ahead. So what we see here is that the programs we do have, the stability in the countries where they've been run, or the threats to stability, I should say, in the countries they've been run, are very diverse. Consequently, what would define a good outcome in those countries is also very, very diverse. And this brings me to, I think, my final slide, and then Tilman will return, about our new case study, which is work that we have planned with Mercy Corps to run in Jordan and Lebanon. As I'm sure everyone listening knows, these countries have experienced an almost unprecedented crisis as host countries of refugees. And there are concerns about intergroup tensions and relationships and so forth, especially in terms of competition for jobs, homes, and so forth. And there are loads and loads and loads of employment for stability programs that have been or are running there, and we're going to evaluate some of them. So although the direct aim of these programs is to reduce competition for the scarce jobs and to boost incomes through training programs, they also have this implicit indirect aim that by reducing those things, they should improve in-group out-group relationships. And that's exactly what we were going to test, and the data collection is just getting underway. And with that, I will pass you back to Tilman. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. This is Tilman speaking again, and I just want to walk you through the conclusions for 1 or 2 minutes. Next slide, please. So as we saw, and as Neil explained in detail, the employment for peace or employment for stability agenda is a sort of catch-all term for a whole large number of programs, which all do very different things, mostly and primarily concerned with employment. So while there are employment programs in fragile and conflict-affected areas, sometimes they're very different from each other and they adopt very different programs. What we think would be helpful is to move beyond the use of these catch-all terms and be much more specific what a specific program can achieve in a specific context, both in terms of the employment creation or support and the peace building. Let me just give one very small example. In one of our studies, we came across an employment creation in the Central African Republic where people were giving a public works program, sort of a cash for work type program, which was just before an important election taking place. And it was supposed to help stabilize the country, stabilize the situation, let the elections take place. But the participants, while they appreciated the cash they earned, they realized that this thing was going to run out. They realized they were building roads that were leading nowhere, to put it very bluntly, and that as soon as the election was going to have taken place, their jobs were finished. So actually they were quite angry about that and quite antagonistic. So while cash transfer can be useful, you really have to think about the people that you engage with and what you promise them and what their expectations are and what their fears and worries are and which of the theories of change really truly may apply, and then go and test that. So what we think is that if you account for what happens at the locality and the specific sort of threats and tensions, but also the opportunities and the constraints on people's human development, you can design better programs. You can put better indicators of peace and stability into the programs, measuring people's attitudes, their views, their behaviors. You know, are they protesting? Are they demonstrating? You can measure both their social, but also maybe their antisocial behavior very specifically. So programs may not save the world or create global peace, but at a local level and at the micro level, they may help make a contribution which is measurable and tangible. And then that could be documented and could be analyzed, contributing to the little bit of evidence that we already have. Next, please. So this slide is supposed to summarize what we think employment for peace programs could usefully do in the future. It's a decision tree. Say you're working in a country and you want to design a program. If it's not an employment program, we're not talking about it here today in the seminar. But if it is an employment program, then think carefully, is it a fragile conflict setting? If it's not, again, it's probably not so relevant for us here today. But if it is, then ask yourself, does my employment program have a peace-building aim, an explicit peace-building aim? And if it doesn't, I would like to say it's actually okay. You can run very successful employment programs adapted for the FCS setting without having an intentional peace-building aim. You may have unintentional peace-building impacts, but that's a positive you can take with you. But then many of these employment programs do have an explicit peace-building aim. And then ask yourself, do you want a specific peace-building component? Like, for example, people meeting in groups and talking about their feelings and their attitudes and their behaviors, etc., or not? And maybe you don't need that. Maybe you just want to have an adapted peace-building program, an adapted employment program, which creates peace by creating employment, pure and simple. Or you have these extra components. But by starting to differentiate out these different branches of the decision tree, we can test for both intentional and unintentional impacts on peace building much more clearly than has been the case in the past. Next. Next, please. So just summing up, if you are interested in what we're doing, these are some of the papers we've published on the topic, which are available either from our website or from us individually. If you want to write to us, our contact details are on the cover slide, and these slides, I think, will be uploaded on the DME for Peace website later if you want to double check them later. I think we're ready to move to the question and answer session now, Jack.
Great, thank you, Tilman, and thank you, Neil, for sort of a really engaging and detailed presentation. And on the further reading, maybe we can upload those resources alongside today's recording so people can have a one-stop shop for all of this.
Sure.
Just a couple of points before we move to the Q&A and things that Neil touched on. I actually couldn't agree more with your assessment about the state of learning and peace building through evaluations. I don't think we make it accessible enough for people because we love to talk in a very technical, jargon-heavy language. And then on that idea of defining peace and stability, this probably comes down to our field and our inability to define ourselves due to a lack of common or shared or standard indicators for our work. Before we open up for questions, a couple of notes about our format. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, you can submit a question one of two ways. The first way you can submit a question is through the question function on GoToWebinar. The second is to click on the little hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask you to submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and our discussion and learn from our wider engagement. And I see the questions are already flying through, so let's get this underway. Our first question comes from Mindy Reiser, and Mindy is from the Global Peace Services USA, and asks, do you have any thoughts as to the effect of the types of jobs with potential for significant mobility and ongoing learning in strengthening individuals' sense of future possibilities and the growth of confidence in the future, which should contribute to engendering a climate of peace?
I think you're asking, Mandy, about the quality of jobs in a sense, right? So I hope I caught you right. If not, please send a clarification. But on quality of jobs, I'd like to say that we probably have to differentiate between two types of jobs. Like my example from the Central African Republic, it is relatively easy to do sort of cash for work type programs, you know, low skilled, easy jobs, which we have to probably recognize, you know, don't convey a lot of value added, or, you know, you don't learn a lot of skills. You know, it's more the cash you earn today and tomorrow's a different day. Yeah. So low skill jobs, short-term jobs, maybe even very informal jobs. You might just show up in the morning and work a day and get paid for the day's labor. Yeah. So not really very great jobs if you look at it from an ILO perspective. The advantage of these jobs is easy to organize, and maybe you can have a relatively large quantitative impact across many people. On the other hand, in some societies, that's not the constraint. That's not the problem. That's not why people are angry. I mean, if you look across the MENA region, for example, take Egypt as a very specific example. For decades, people have been told, you know, invest in education, go to school. You know, first they were told go to primary school, become literate. Then they were told go to secondary school. Then they were told to go to university. And now finally they realize, you know, it doesn't matter how many years of education they have. There's still no jobs for them, yeah, or at least no good jobs, no formal jobs, not the jobs that they want to have, which go to other people, you know, maybe politically connected people or, you know, certain groups, yeah. So a lot of pent up frustration from people who are very highly qualified. And if you have a university graduate and you offer them a, you know, sort of a daily casual wage labor job, you know, that's obviously not going to help. Yeah. On the other hand, the interventions needed to create high skilled jobs in Egypt are much more complex, and they may contribute to peace in Egypt or reduction in fragility, but it's a very long and complicated impact chain, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Mindy. The next question comes from Jessica Burns, and Jessica asks, we've heard about impact on peace and stability with mixed results, but what do we know about the impact on employment, economy, of employment for peace stability programs?
So just so as I understand the question, what we're talking about here is the understanding of whether or not these employment programs successfully build employment out with whether or not they build peace. So again, if that's not quite the understanding, please let me know and I will try and tailor the answer. And I think the answer here is also mixed. I think Chris Blattman and Laura Ralston have a World Bank white paper where they talk about this in great depth, that, if you look at a small number of individual case studies, you can pull out really interesting information about jobs programs functioning and things like that. And I think if we take two of the examples I talked about, which I assume make it into Chris and Laura's work, there is the work in northern Uganda from the cash transfers. And what this finds is that people are economically significantly better off as a result of being a part of this program. In Afghanistan, in the Mercy Corps program, exactly the same thing happens. In a skills program, people I think there's a very high employment rate of people afterwards. I think it's something like 2/3 of the people in the program who were unemployed at the beginning have found employment at the end of it. And I think on one hand, those sound all very, very positive and things like that. But I think the other side of it, or the two other sides of it, are that there are loads and loads of employment programs that aren't necessarily evaluated and that we don't know whether they've had impacts or not. In terms of the entire universe of employment programs, the number that have been evaluated and shown a positive impact are very, very small. The second thing is how that interacts with the wider economy. And I think the story I always tell was I was in the field in Liberia, and I met a young woman who had gone through a training program and had learned to become a baker, and had learned business skills and everything else to go along with that. And her business privately had done very well. But the result of this was that the demand in the economy for baked goods was the same as it had been before she started her bakery. And so the impact of her success was that there was damage to someone else's business, and this caused frustration. And I think that's a sort of more general lesson that we need to think through, that one, many programs change individual competitiveness, not the economy as a whole. And secondly, it's therefore really important to understand how those programs interact, not just with the individuals or with the lives of the individuals who go through them, but also with the lives of individuals who don't and who could potentially be adversely affected. And I think on that note, one place where I will stop here is Johannes Haushofer and some of his colleagues did a study in Kenya, if I remember correctly, where they show really positive impacts on participants in a jobs program from it. But actually the neighbors of those people, their emotional welfare went down as a result, basically, well, for one of a multitude of reasons. So I think in that sense, what's missing is, one, the complete overview of knowledge of how employment programs work, rather than that can be put together from individual case studies. And secondly, how this works in the macroeconomy or in a general equilibrium situation.
Great, thank you very much, Neil.
Maybe I could just add something briefly, Jack?
Yes, go right ahead.
So what these jobs for peace programs can do is, or how they can work, is through one of two mechanisms. Well, on the one hand, they can create jobs, and if you have a job, you might have less grievance, you might have more opportunity, you might have more contact to other people. So all our impact channels that Neil outlined in the seminar apply there. But there is another impact channel, and that is that it might just be the pure program effect. So maybe you're in a skills training, and the skills training is absolutely useless. You're not learning anything. But the guy next to you is from that other ethnic group that you heard so much bad about. And you go, well, that's weird. I always thought these other guys were really lazy, but this guy's really nice and pleasant and hardworking, and maybe I should revise my expectations about the other group, which I've heard about so much and so much negative stuff. So it could be that the training as such doesn't have any economic impact, but it could have a strong peace building impact through the program itself, just what we call the program effect. And I think that is what makes these jobs for peace programs different, that they can have one of two ways of influencing people. Yeah, and so it's like a matrix. You have the opportunity, the grievance, and the contact in 3 rows, and then you have the 2 columns, the jobs effect and the program effect. Yeah, and any one program can have any one of these. So sorry, that's a complication of what we said earlier, but I think it might be useful in the context of these programs, and how come these programs for peace can have impact when maybe job programs cannot or do have impact. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, guys. And then the next question from Alina Slavova, who works at International Alert in Lebanon, I think builds on this. And Alina asks, have you found evidence on which pathways, contact, theory, opportunity, have been most effective in the projects you looked into?
I think the short answer is no. The long answer is no, with an explanation as to why. What we tend to find is that, as you've, I think, seen from the slides, the projects that have been reviewed and evaluated, this information is so often missing. And it's so often missing both in terms of the expectation of how the program works, as well as an output. So while we're saying that what is missing is going from A, which is the employment program, as an input, to B, to peace as an output, what we're in effect saying is that they go from A to B via C, which is contact, grievance, or opportunity. And given that we don't really know where we are in going from A to B, it's a sort of additional complication to go from A to B via C. So although that is the long-term desirability to try and understand which of these theories of change might work best and in which contexts those theories are relevant, I don't think that is something that, at least from the work that we have done, that we are capable of saying right now.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. The next question comes from Milt Lowenstein, a previous host of the M&E Thursday Talks. And Milt asks, what data exists about the cost effectiveness of job creation relative to preventing violence? And I think that's specifically referring to these programs. How much do they cost compared to the return on investment?
So what I will say first is that in our pseudo-meta-analysis, we end up with 10 programs very closely clustered in space over maybe 2 or 3 years across the 5 countries that we think are large enough for the analysis. And in combination, those 10 programs cost over $10 billion. The outlay is absolutely vast, and I will parse that enormously, Greg, I've just given you by saying that a quite considerable amount of that was spent in Liberia. But we're dealing with programs that cost lots and lots and lots of money. And on the flip side, I think what I would say next is that the return on investment of peace building programs, I think, is sort of an interesting and relatively novel place in the literature of trying to understand which programs might reduce conflict and develop peace and so forth. I think what we can take from that is that it will probably depend how peace is defined and how that can be turned into cost. So to give you an example, I've done some work recently with Topher McDougall from Mercy Corps, and there we're trying to understand the impact of US peacebuilding expenditure on GDP via a reduction in conflict. And what we find there is that the cost of saving a life through peacebuilding is about $120,000, and that will contribute about $10,000 to that country's GDP. And that sounds like a really terrible return on investment, that you are talking about 12 to 15 times the saving from given the outlay. But at the same time, there is more to a life saved via reduced conflict than GDP. There might be the local economic impact that person makes him or herself. There's the statistical value of life, and so forth. And so I think those questions are things that need to be answered before one would draw a firm conclusion. But I think what we can say is that, 1, these programs are expensive. Number 2, I think we probably know, if you listen to particular debates, that a lot of employment programs aren't viewed as particularly cost effective. If you're going to spend $2,000 to put someone through a training and it improves their income by $2 a day. It's a long time to recoup that money. But the third one is that the impact of peace is something that could be much broader than we would simply measure in a traditional sense. And I think our work with Mercy Corps shows that the outlay is expensive, the straight line economic gain is comparatively small, but by the time you try and factor in all of the other things that it could influence, actually the balance is much better.
Just lost you there for a second, Neil. If you could just repeat the last 15 seconds of your answer.
Yeah, sure. So what I said was that I think the third part is that if you look at very narrow measures of the return on peace building expenditure, then it might seem that it's a bad deal. But given that peace interacts with so many of the aspects of life at the individual level, at the regional level, the national level, and so forth, that actually the return probably balances much better than a headline figure might suggest.
Yeah, and I just maybe to build off that, just quite curious, and it may be a topic for a future webinar, but how did you come about what was your in a couple of minutes, what was your methodology for coming to the 120,000 in cost as opposed to the 10,000 in economic yield for GDP?
How nerdy should I be?
As nerdy as you want in 2 minutes.
Okay, so we balanced the sample. We took the potential endogeneity that places with the worst conflict are the places that get the most peace building expenditure, the peace building aid, sorry. And so we balanced the sample by looking at countries that differed in their aid receipts, but that were actually the same in terms of conflict history. So both the type of conflict, the extent of conflict, and the historical extent of conflict. Then we conducted a sort of two-stage structural analysis. In the first stage, we looked at the impact of peace-building expenditure and the number of battle deaths. And in the second stage, we then used the number of battle deaths as a mediator for the impact in GDP. And what we found was that, well, from the coefficients of that, we were able to take that back to the input data that we had, and we cranked through and got these figures. So what we tend to find is that the number of battle deaths reduces GDP a very small amount, and then we calculated this from the amount of spending and the number of lives that would have been saved in that country from the coefficients.
That is fascinating, and always great to see that we're using more than proxy indicators for things like this. And I'm going to use this opportunity just to wrap things up today and say thank you to Neil and Tilman for being wonderful hosts and for such a clear and engaging presentation. And thank you to the DME for Peace community for joining another edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. I love these discussions. It's the best part of my job. So thank you all. Just a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be posted on the DME for Peace Media Gallery later today. And we hope to upload those readings as well as today's slides. So feel free to continue the discussion online in the comment section. We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time on June 7th with the Impact Project out of Brandeis University as we discuss arts and peace building and monitoring and evaluation. And this is going to be a consultation. So we hope you're all able to join us to offer your input, whether you're an arts-based practitioner, whether you're a peace builder, whether you have no connection at all. We'd love to hear your thoughts and get your input. Once again, thank you, Neil. Thank you, Tilman. And I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for having us.